Hey there, welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be showing you how I made this diorama of the Sumeru Rainforest from Genshin Impact. Sumeru is my favourite region in Genshin Impact, at the time of recording of course. The rainforest is absolutely gorgeous, and the desert is beautiful as well. I knew I wanted to make a diorama that combined multiple aspects of the rainforest into one. So this diorama is less of a representation of what you see in game, and more of a combination of elements. I'm probably going to do something similar when I inevitably make a diorama for the desert. Chances are I'll also do this with other regions in Genshin Impact. It's a big game after all. Taking a piece of MDF board, I glue some pieces of foam core board to it, already pre-cut to my desired shape. This will eventually become the ground and the riverbank. I then take some larger chunks of XPS foam and start gluing them around the base. These were also pre-cut, and I keep adding layers until I'm happy with the height. The central rock was carved out of another piece of XPS foam and shaped accordingly, and then I go about shaping the rock's walls the same way. I realised pretty early on that the sides of the diorama were going to be pretty ugly if I didn't do something about it, so I opted to cover everything up with pieces of cardboard that I'd already cut to size. I then turned my attention to the larger of the trees in this diorama. Taking some super thick tubes of aluminium foil, I cut them to size, and then start gluing wires into them using hot glue. The wires are bent into shape, with the top half being the tops of the trees and the bottom half being the roots. The trees are then secured in place with a mixture of PVA glue and tissues. This was done to give them a bark texture, and at the time I didn't think this would actually work. It was very much a trust the process moment. I did go back and secure some of the looser sections with more hot glue once everything had dried, however. All of the rocks then get a very thick layer of watered down modelling paste, which is then stippled to look more like rock. I then spread on a layer of PVA glue, and then sprinkle on some craft sand. Once painted, this will become dirt. Time to move on to the next big part of this diorama, the robot. It's called a ruin golem, but the name doesn't really matter here, it's just a big robot. Taking a cheap foam ball that I picked up for this project specifically, I start adding details with bits of cardboard, including the eye and the metal plate details. I initially wanted to carve these out of the foam itself, but I quickly realised that that wasn't going to work. So I swapped to using the cardboard to imply that there's plates on the foam. To make the massive robot hand, I just used pieces of clay and then shaped them into a vaguely hand-like shape. The robot's hand is pretty blocky, so I wasn't worried about it looking like a massive rectangle. Once baked, I then assembled the arm, which consisted of 2 pieces of XPS foam, a gear charm, and this specific Gundam bit. I have no idea what it is, I hope it's not important. The arm was then anchored in place with a piece of wire. All of the parts then received a mix of modelling paste and bicarb soda of all things. This was to give everything a rusty metallic texture. Everything was then primed black and then dry brushed copper, my preferred method of painting metal, as you know. As a finishing touch, I painted the eye using orange, pale orange, and then a yellow. Some of these robots in-game are still capable of firing lasers at you, and I wanted this one to be looking directly at you when you look at the diorama dead on. So it made sense to me that it would be gearing up to fire its laser. With that, the robot's done, let's move on to painting the base. I decided to skip some of the painting process this time, and primed the entire model brown. There's a lot of brown on this model actually. Probably too much. I probably should have painted the rocks a different colour. Once the initial brown coats were done, I dry brushed everything with lighter browns, then washed the rocks and the trees with brown and black respectively. This was then followed up with another light brown dry brush. I set the robot and the hand in place, and then move on to the next step. It took nearly 2 years, but I'm doing it. I'm using resin. UV resin, mind you, but it's still resin. Following the directions on the bottle, I mix up about 20 ml of UV resin and colour it using some blue dye. I did try my hand at making a resin coaster before I did this. It's not warped, it's not cracked, the colours aren't ugly, it's perfect. I mask off the side of the diorama so that the resin won't leak out, and then pray that I don't mess this up. No pressure or anything. I opted for a very shallow pour. I'm aware that UV resin won't cure very well if the mould is opaque, so my hope was that I'd be able to cheat by just having a very thin layer of resin. I used a silicone brush to help coax the resin into the various nooks and crannies, and then went about curing it section by section. The fact that my UV lamp actually fits is nothing short of a miracle. I did not plan that in advance. Once everything had cured, it was time to remove the tape and start adding the greenery. I put down a layer of PVA glue and add the fake grass, the fake leaves, and the fake moss all over the diorama. What I'm not going to show is the countless hours spent wiping the UV resin lake, free of all this debris, with isopropyl alcohol. Everything is then sprayed down with more isopropyl alcohol, which is then followed up with some PVA glue to seal everything in. I then use clump foliage to add the foliage to the trees, which is then sealed the same way. Time for the finer details. Starting off with the thing that haunts my dreams, the dendroculi. I made 3 of them, and I made them out of green clay. They're basically just a ball with 2 vaguely leaf-like shapes on the sides. I didn't stop there with the Genshin-related trauma. What would the rainforest be without an Aranara hut? No, there's not going to be any Aranara to find in this rainforest, I promise. But because I made 2 of these huts, and some mushrooms as well out of clay, it's safe to assume that there are some living in this diorama. From there it's just a case of adding all of the clay details, as well as some additional clump foliage for added ground cover. For the final finishing touches, I add a gloss varnish to the resin lake, and then dot on some lily pads with green paint. And with that, it's finished. Thank you for watching. I would argue that this is my most ambitious project to date, if only because of the resin, although I suspect this diorama won't hold that title for very long. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, have a good one.